The empire of Karl Franz stretches from the Sea of Claws in the north to the Black Mountains in the south. And beyond that perilous range, the wild and untamed lands of the Border Princes. It is a beacon of civilization in an untamed world. Sigmar, its founder, is now a god. His influence still shepherding his chosen peoples. From mighty Altdorf, all are fairly ruled. From the poorest citizen to the most luminous noble, each a proud heir to Sigmar's glorious destiny. That, at least, is what the child and the sycophant claim. The truth of life in the Empire is rarely glorious, often short, and never without peril. If you wish to climb out of the gutter, you better have the coin to pay for the privilege, or failing that, a blade to cut your way free. The Empire itself is a fractious mess. A handful of great provinces vying for power, and always with a keen eye towards snatching any advantage from a neighbor. The nobility are witless hedonists, or scheming misanthropes, heedless of the suffering left in their wake. This cantankerous state cannot go on, and indeed revolutionaries whisper of a better world. Some preach that ancient and terrible gods, the ruinous powers of chaos, offer the only hope of change. Their plots and unseen deeds suffuse the old world, and patiently they await that prophesied day when they will arise from their secret places and throw down the works of man and elf and dwarf to usher in a terrible age of chaos. This is a grim and perilous world, and there are no heroes here.
Hello everyone, and welcome to RPG Quest. I'm not sure how you stumbled across this podcast, but thanks nonetheless for putting it on. My name is Chris, and this is the very first episode of RPG Quest, a podcast where we do not play Dungeons and Dragons. But we do play tabletop RPGs, and this is my, I suppose you would call, personal quest to try as many RPGs as I can, and also to convince you to try them out too. I don't have a problem with Dungeons and Dragons. Like, after all, it was my gateway into RPGs all those years ago, and I think that's the case for most people. But where my problem lies is there seems to be this widespread unwillingness to try out new and different systems. This is something that I've seen a lot. You've probably seen it too, like someone on Reddit or Facebook or Discord discussing their insane and janky homebrew or hack on how to do like a modern urban adventure or a no magic gritty low fantasy campaign or like space cowboy adventure or something, which is fine. But I always say like, hey, you should try a different system. And people are resistant to change. I get it, but it's not that scary. So like I'm here, I guess, to help. And the first system that I wanted to check out, I did a lot of tossing and turning, trying to decide what I was going to do for the first episode. The first system that I wanted to check out is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And to do that, I am joined by Dan Cole.
Hello.
So Dan, you're from the Professional Casual Network.
I am.
The GM. Well, tell us about your podcast as well.
Sure, yeah. So I am the GM of a Grim podcast, A Perilous Adventure. They call me the bad GM because they don't always like my decisions. At least I like to think that's why they call me that. But yeah, we've been playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay on the podcast for almost 2.5 years now. And we're playing the Enemy Within campaign, and it's just been a blast.
Nice. And where can people find it?
So you could check out a Grim Podcast, A Perilous Adventure, pretty much anywhere you get podcasts. And yeah, we've got we have video for it, starting with like episode 21 on our Patreon, which you can just search Professional Casual. We have a couple other actual plays as well, featuring like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we're going to be getting into Soulbound really soon.
Amazing. All right. Now, the reason I chose Warhammer, right, is because I think one of the main complaints I see about D&D, or like people asking for help on how to tweak and hack D&D, is often like, my players are too powerful. Like, I don't like, the power creep. They level up too quickly, or they can heal too quickly. They just spam long rests, and it's not sort of dark and brutal enough. So I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay kind of scratches that itch. But I want to, before we get into that, I want to ask you, like, why did you pick up Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay for this podcast and not, say, like D&D?
Oh, all right. So that's got to go back to like when I first started playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, when 2nd edition came out back in like 2005. I had just gotten into Warhammer. I just discovered role-playing, and I was like, oh, man, it'd be so cool if there was an RPG for the Warhammer world. And then I did a Google search, and it was like, yeah, the new edition releases in like 2 months. And I was like, sold! And we played a ton of it in college. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. And then when 4th edition came out, it was like, well, I was playing other games at the time. And then like COVID lockdown stuff happened, and it was like, we started up our podcast network, and I was like, I want to do an actual play. And everybody else was like, what is that? And I was like, well, we play an RPG and we record it. And they're like, okay. I'll play an RPG. Sounds good. And I was like, let's do Warhammer. There's a new edition. Love to go back to that game. And it was like, from the first session, it was like match made in heaven. It's been so awesome. We have some people on the show back from my old college groups. And we get to play that every other week, which is a dream come true for RPG players.
Yeah, awesome. You kind of just did it, but I was going to ask, like if I were to say, like, give me your elevator pitch, like your 30-second elevator pitch, like Shark Tank, on why someone should play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
One of my favorite descriptions of it, Tim said on one of our shows, where he said, you play as grubs in the mud. Which might not be a great sell at first, but like if you want to play something that's a bit darker, grittier, that low fantasy that does have some access to things like magic and crazy monsters and whatnot, but you want something that you feel every hit in combat, this is that game. Or if you want a game that doesn't have much combat, the old world is perfect for that. There's so much intrigue. There's so much, internal conflict between the ruling nations and everything that you can do a whole campaign without combat easy.
Yeah. I want to get into the kind of adventures and that sort of thing in a second, but I guess very quickly, like, most people have heard of Warhammer and the Warhammer franchise to some extent, right? There's most people associate it with the models and the war game. I was never really into Warhammer, but my cousin collected and painted all the minis, so he had like a massive collection of all the 40k minis. And yeah, as a franchise, it's been around for a while, so there's a lot of insane lore about this world with the war games and the video games and everything. Before we get into the differences of like the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay world, because as you said, it's a lot more kind of grounded and very low fantasy compared to the epic high fantasy of the Warhammer battle game. Can you like help me out with a brief rundown of just kind of the setting and the world?
Sure, yeah. So typically games of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay take place in the Empire, it sounds like your generic human area at first, but there are elves and dwarves and halflings and even ogres that live among each other, usually in relative peace. Whereas there's, even within the Empire itself, all the provinces are constantly warring with each other. There's just this constant battle for, the borders moving and taking over, and tons of political intrigue. What I love about the Warhammer world is how well defined it is over the decades it's been developed. The first edition of the game came out in the mid or even early 80s, and they did a lot of weird stuff back then that some of it's been changed over the years, but things are so well defined that it's like these places you visit in the game, the major cities and everything really feel like an actual believable world. It's not just, oh, there's a town here and then you got to travel 8 days to get to another random town. Like they really have relationships with each other. Again, it's just so well defined. There's so much there. I know some people might think, well, I don't want it to tell me everything I have to do. And it's like, well, the whole thing is that it sets up for what you want to do in that world because there's so much there for you to draw from.
I guess if you don't know much about the setting, I know some people are like, oh, do I have to play in this setting? Like, oh, I don't want to read and learn everything about the setting. I don't think you really need to know too much about it. And I think maybe the benefit of it and kind of what sets it apart from Tolkien and like the out-of-the-box D&D worlds is that it kind of draws a lot of different real-world historical periods. Like there's Renaissance, there's gun and gunpowder, there's like medieval France, there's things like the Black Plague, and it kind of smushes everything all together into this kind of weird, gritty, fantasy setting.
Yeah, it might help if you know anything about European history, which I don't much. So I think a lot of there's another thing I love about Warhammer is it's one part gritty, nasty, death, muddy world, and another part silly humor, where a lot of the names are jokes. A lot of the stuff is the language the Empire speaks is called Reichsspiel, which is supposed to be like an Englishman's version of German. From when it was first created, it was just like a lot of the Reichsspiel words are made up like pidgin German from what people at Games Workshop knew at the time, just being English and being near Germany, which is just, I find it really funny. I love that aspect of it where it should be part horror, part absurd to me, at least.
Yeah, there is something about having looked at it, there's something about the humor of it. I think it's very, it's like Pratchett-esque almost. Dark, maybe a little bit darker.
Right. There's so much of that English humor that you, I'm sure the English get a lot better than an American like myself. But like, I've watched enough British TV over the years to have a little bit more of an appreciation for that special blend of British humor that's just a little out there.
The Warhammer Fantasy world's like very well established. The world in the battle game is like huge and epic, but as you said, the way Tim described it was grubs in the mud.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very like different feel, right? Like instead of you're more likely to be dealing with like famine and disease, corrupt politicians as you are dragons and dungeons and that kind of thing. I think you kind of get a sense of that, how grounded this is and gritty and down to earth, like right from the get-go with character creation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can roll... Another thing I love about this game, the career system, as opposed to the 12 or so classes in D&D, here you have a few dozen careers that you build your character up from. Either they can continue doing their career while they're adventuring, or it's like, this is what I was before I became an adventurer. And you can roll a beggar. You can start as a beggar, which is just, you can't get lower than that. Then there's just some classic Warhammer ones in there, like a rat catcher, which is strangely competent at what it does. The witch hunter, of course. You can be like a wizard. There's a couple different ways to get magic, which is really cool. But you got to be real careful with it because you roll poorly and weird things happen, like accidentally summon some demons, maybe.
Yes.
But yeah, the career system is just a treasure trove of fun and awesome things. Some of them are... The game does not go out of its way at all to balance things. Like, if you roll up a human beggar, you are not as good as an elf pit fighter or something like that. Especially, they're going to just outshine you in combat completely, and that's okay in this game.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't feel that way. So it encourages you to do the random character generation. You can make your characters the way you want, but like when we rolled up our players for the actual play in the next few episodes, when my players rolled up their characters, we had a peasant farmer, like a board who's a nude model. a young seaman who's actually a landsman because he's never seen the sea, and then just one warrior priest. This guy rolled really well, but it didn't feel unbalanced. Like everyone had these amazing moments to shine. I think the peasant farmer, she like took out a mutant in one swing almost. Like it's there's fun in the imbalance, I guess. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I always say that's why we roll the dice, right? Like your warrior priest could totally flub on his attack with whatever he's got, but then your farmer can roll a crit and stab the goblin in the face or whatever might happen, and crazy stuff is happening all the time because combat is brutal.
Yeah. I'll get into combat later, but I wanted to pick on something you mentioned before, like about magic being super dangerous. So this is the other thing I think that sets Warhammer apart from the others, is that what elements of fantasy and magic that do seep through are almost always utterly horrific and terrifying.
Yes.
Which I love.
Yeah, especially when you first start out, like the chance, you have just about as much of a chance of miscasting and having something crazy and weird happen as you do actually succeeding on the spell. Which again, is that balanced for that character? Not really, and that's okay.
Yeah.
As they improve, wizards become crazy powerful. To the point where there's a very low chance for them to miscast. And that makes perfect sense. As they do it, they get better at it. Their abilities are more refined and focused. So, yeah, there's that progression works really well in this game.
Yeah, awesome. And there's another thing as well, in a similar note, where this is, again, unique from other games, and it's something to the Warhammer world. It's called chaos. Like, chaos is what? It's like a force. It's not quite magic. It's like a force throughout the world.
Yeah, so like there's the chaos gods, who are like the embodiment of the realm of chaos, which is like the other world, like the otherworldly, dimension that's right adjacent to the actual physical world, and they can kind of influence the world where their demons can come through, but all magic is actually directly connected to the realm of chaos. All the winds of magic that wizards can manipulate to cast spells comes from the realm of chaos. So like wizards are certainly seen, they're viewed with a lot of like trepidation. Like people don't trust wizards. They're terrifying, even if they're like, you can be like a state sanctioned wizard and go to the colleges of magic, and people are still gonna like make the Hammer of Sigmar sign as you walk by because you're weird and freaky.
Yeah, and I guess the other aspect of that is because chaos and magic it does have bad real world effects. Like it can unleash physical mutation and corruption. So there's all these species and civilizations around the world that have been corrupted by chaos, and then within like the empire and the civilized world as well, there's like, as you go through the forests and across the roads, there are mutants and beastmen, these animal human hybrids that have been corrupted by chaos, that are kind of these outcasts, that are these dangerous beings that live beyond like the city walls and stuff.
Oh, I love beastmen so much. They're what got me into Warhammer in the first place. But yeah, the whole mutant thing is so great, where it can happen to anybody. It can happen just randomly from the powers in the world, but the more you mess with this stuff, the higher chance you have of becoming mutated. So like on a long enough timeline, your PCs will become mutated to some degree. And sometimes they're things you can hide. Sometimes they're not. Like you can grow a second head. In our game right now on the podcast, most of the party is mutated, but they're all lucky in that they're all things that can be hidden. A couple of them you can have mental or physical mutations. A few of them got mental mutations, which are pretty easy to hide. They just act weird in some situations. But one person has stretchy arms, like Mr. Fantastic, but he can choose to do it or not. So he's been able to keep it under wraps. And I just love that aspect of it, that like one of the characters is now a witch hunter. So if she found out that another person in the party was a mutant, she would feel pretty obligated to destroy them.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I love about the game as well, is like, beastmen even if you're mutated through no fault of your own, you're a heretic and you must be cleansed, and there are these pious witch hunters walking around, killing them all. It's great. And some of the mutations are are very funny. Some of them, the mental mutations, they're just things like you kind of get a bit jittery, maybe stuff that's very easy to hide. And then another one, you might have full like animal legs, goat legs or something.
Yeah, the range of it is wild, and I love it. One of the additional books that came out had a expanded table where they even have specific tables for the 4 chaos gods. So like if the PC tends to act more like they catch the eye of one of the chaos gods, you can roll on that table in particular, which I do for our characters, where it's like, well, yeah, you really like killing people, so you're going to roll on the corn table and get something crazy. Maybe your arm will turn into a sword, or maybe you'll just be real angry all the time.
Yeah, nice. Oh, that's brutal, but so good. All right. So with all that in mind, I wanted to get into, you did talk about this. I wanted to get into the types of adventures that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay like really lends itself to running. Like, as you mentioned, a lot of the original campaign modules, like the old ones that I've seen, do seem to be geared more towards social interaction and investigation and that type of thing. Would you say that that's probably right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are all kinds of things like corrupt politicians, cultists trying to bring around the end of the world, disease, famine. Now, I was going to talk about this before I even went and listened to your podcast. Probably the most famous of the campaign modules, the one that I've seen mentioned the most, is The Enemy Within. And that's the one that you're playing, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was such good timing that it was like, well, they're redoing The Enemy Within, and I've always heard it's like the best campaign out there, and I was like, let's just play that. It'll take years, but who knows what's happening to the world right now? Let's start that. So we just dove right in. And it was like it wasn't complete when when we first started, the second book wasn't even out yet of the new like director's cut. So it was like, I don't know what's coming next, but it looks pretty cool. And we actually just finished the second book recently. Episodes that are coming out now will be finishing up book 2, Death on the Reich, which is so good. It's just, the whole campaign is amazing. And I mean, it tells you right in the title, The Enemy Within is so great. The themes throughout it are so well done, where it's like, it's not so much the monsters of chaos that are the bad guys in the world. It's those that are in power, that are corrupted, that will bring things down from the inside. And it even works even better within our own party. We have almost like enemies within the party. We had some animosity in the beginning between a couple characters, and they've kind of patched things up, and then animosity grows between 2 other characters, and it's just, it works so well on so many layers. It's a fantastic campaign. A lot of intrigue, a fair bit of combat. What we're getting into next is going to be so much intrigue. I know the players are going to love it, where there's so many NPCs they get to interact with and they love to do, and they're going to eat it up.
Nice. Is it 5 books in total? It ends up being, or?
Yeah, and the 5th book is like massive. I don't have it in print yet, but it's big. It's like 100 pages longer than the other books, and it's just like, oh, maybe there should have been 6.
Obviously, I don't want any spoilers. I don't want to spoil it, but very briefly, like, what is the kind of the hook of The Enemy Within?
So the very beginning, the party is just, essentially they're traveling together but aren't like a party yet. They have each character come up with a reason to be traveling to Altdorf for what some minor reason. And on the way, they discover somebody that looks just like one of the party members. And on their person, they have paperwork to show they were traveling to another city to collect a huge inheritance is the word. So then it's like, well, you're all poor, probably starting out. So this person looks exactly like you. Head to this city and collect this inheritance, and then things get crazy.
Nice. And I believe it involves like a lot of mistaken identity, which can be very funny as well.
Yeah, it's so great when the people that are looking for the lookalike that's dead interact with the party, and the party's just so confused, like, what is going on? They don't understand. There's so much mystery to it. And it's a huge sprawling adventure, over 5 books. It essentially be like the equivalent of D&D, like going from 1 to level 20, more or less, where by the end of the campaign, you're doing some pretty epic stuff. So the whole game doesn't always have to be grubs in the mud. The characters will get like really good at what they do as they go on, and it does get a bit more epic scale, but you can easily play the game at that low level all the time and still have a blast.
Yeah, nice. Do you have any standout moments, I guess, from the campaign so far?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. So, at this point, we've recorded 140 episodes. So, you're talking probably close to 200 hours of the game. My favorite moments are between combats when we have an episode or a few of just roleplay stuff, where there was one scene where my wife plays in the game. She plays Mina, and she is like on watch one night, and she starts talking to a duck, which is ridiculous, let's be honest. But one of the party members summoned a duck as a spell and just kind of befriended it, and it's like basically a member of the party now. So Mina's having this conversation with the duck, and she goes into this story, a part of her backstory that she had like mentioned before, but like things happened to kind of bring it back into her mind, and she got into it, and like my wife Danny, she got so into it she actually started crying about this past. And when we were done with the episode, she was like, was that too much? Is that okay? Like she's like, I don't even know what happened. Like, I feel like I blacked out, because it's like the stuff I'm crying about's not even real.
Yeah.
But it was like, no, that was such a great moment, because it was so like, it was so real, because like when we start playing the game, like they really become those characters. Like once we start recording, Danny is not Danny anymore. She's Mina. JB is Bruno, like they jump into those characters and they hit it so well that those are my favorite moments. There's awesome stuff that happens in combat, but when it's those moments where they really get into their character and do those kind of deep dives into who this character is what really stands out to me.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. It's like a therapy duck. That's great.
Right. I think we were calling him the emotional support duck at that point.
Emotional support duck, yes. So as you were saying, you've been playing for a while. Warhammer's gone through a few editions. We won't really go into that. But now with the fourth edition, which came out, I think 2018, right? It's kind of back to basics. They brought it back to the original system. It's got all those grim dark sensibilities and that humor. And I think it's great because a lot of the older adventures and stuff are pretty much cut and paste compatible with the fourth edition as well, if you want to pick up the old adventures.
Oh, yeah, super easy. Cubicle 7 even came out with a free PDF that's a conversion guide to like, hey, you want to take an old first or second edition adventure? Like, this is what you can do to convert the stats over to make it as easy as possible. And it's like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's look at the system very quickly. It is a D100 system, which people might be familiar with if you've played like RuneQuest or Call of Cthulhu or something like that. So I think they're the only dice you need, right? Is like a D100, a D10, and a 100 die.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, awesome. So let's kind of go through that a little bit. Basically, everything kind of runs on rolling a D100. The basic test is like, you throw a D100 against your skill or your characteristic, and if you roll lower, you succeed. If you roll higher, you fail. I think a 1 to 5 is always a success, and like a 96 to 100 is always a fail. Like that's a basic test.
Yeah.
But then where I think it gets like really interesting is dramatic tests and opposed tests, which are these situations where it's not just a pass fail. There is a degree of how much you succeed, which might be in combat, might be out of combat. And I think that's like great. Like it really differs from things like Dungeons and Dragons because you're able to succeed by degrees. Like you might have this horribly clumsy success, or you might have an amazing success. And I think it definitely makes the game a lot more interesting. So I guess, yeah, could you help me explain like a little bit of like the concept of success levels and how that works and plays into the game? Yeah,
so success levels are pretty super integral to the way the game works most of the time, especially in combat, where for every difference the tens place is from what you were testing on, you have a degree of success or a degree of failure. So like if you're rolling on a 55 and you roll a 35, you've got 2 success levels. But if you're testing on that 55 and rolling 85, you've got 3 negative success levels. And for most things out of combat, typically just did you pass or fail is good enough, but it can be real fun for the GM to kind of make stuff up, especially if people fail really poorly. Like, oh, you tried to jump over this little, 6 foot wide river, but you rolled 6 negative success levels. So like, like what happens there kind of thing, I think can open up a lot, the yes and or no but kind of things that you can throw in there and really mess with stuff. One of my favorite things they did with 4th edition was the introduction of the oppose test you mentioned a minute ago, which I think was a huge improvement to combat, where if I'm attacking a player, we both roll. They can roll to try to dodge it or deflect it with a weapon or a shield or whatever. And even if you don't pass the test, you can still win the opposed test by rolling better than your opponent, which actually speeds things up in combat, because previous editions had a bad whiff factor where it's like, well, my weapon skill's 45, so I'm failing most of the time trying to hit something, where here you could still roll an 80 something and succeed because your opponent rolled that 96 to 100 and auto-failed.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing worse, I'm sure, that not to keep like bashing on D&D. I'm not trying to do that, but like there's been so many moments where an enemy is like asleep or on the ground, and you're there standing on top of them, and you roll to try and hit and put the enemy down, and like you still miss, and it's like, how did my knight not manage to strike this body that's just lying there?
Right, where here you've got a bunch of modifiers. So it's like, well, they're prone and they're not aware, so you just do an automatic critical hit, and you're probably just gonna chop their head off or whatever.
Exactly, and that's good as well. Like, as opposed to, I like systems where you roll against your skill rather than the GM setting some kind of static difficulty, and you got to match that. It's you roll against your skill, but then there are certain situations where the GM might adjust the difficulty. Like, so I think a challenging test is like there's no modifier, you just roll straight against your skill. Then you've got like average, which you give them a plus 20. Easy, you give them a plus 40, and it works like the other way as well. So like, yeah, maybe you're listening out for someone in a quiet building or something, and I might be like, okay, that's just a challenging test, just roll your perception. But maybe you're trying to listen out through some winds or some storm or something like that. So I might make that a difficult or a hard test, which then you add that minus 10 or minus 20 to their level that they need to hit, which is cool, the difficulty level.
Yeah,
so I do like that as well.
Real mad.
Yeah.
It's a hard test? Well, yeah.
Yeah, and it's great. There's the combat difficulty is there's a similar thing. Yeah, I think if you outnumber an opponent 2-1, it becomes an average test. If you outnumber them 3-1, it's an easy test. So if they're like engaged and facing the other way, so there's all these kind of things that make it much easier to hit, which I think is great as well, or harder to hit as well, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, I think it needed for the system. We played a lot of 2nd edition that didn't have any modifiers like that. It was like, well, if you're rolling to hit in combat, you're rolling your weapon skill or lower. And a lot of times it was pretty low. So it speeds up the game. It makes it more dynamic, where even when it's not the player's turn, they need to be paying attention, because it's like, all right, I'm trying to hit you. What are you going to do? And there's all kinds of options they've got to try to not take damage or negate the damage or minimize the damage. Because then it comes to who did better, how many success levels there were, and, factors into that damage, where it's like, oh, well, even though you failed to dodge, you're only taking 1 damage because you got a few success levels, and that makes it less of a hit on my end, which I really enjoy. So it keeps people on their toes. Even when I get confused and forget whose turn it is and try to do damage when I was dodging.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. There was a moment in the game that I recorded where, the warrior priest had taken a huge hit and he was down on one knee, and there's this beast man in front of him that's about to give a final blow, and he swings his sword and rolled terribly, but luckily I rolled even worse for the beast man. So it's this real clumsy kind of swing of the sword, and lops his arm off, which is great.
Nice.
And yeah, you were saying that your level of success gets added to your damage, which I think is great. Like, a weapon's damage is static, so there's kind of less swing. Like, you just have a weapon might do 5 points of damage or 6 points of damage plus your strength bonus, for instance, if it's a melee, and then you add the number of success levels to that, as damage. So if you hit well, you can do awesome damage, but there is the floor of minimum damage is a little higher as well, which I like. You're not going to just roll a 1 on your damage die, for instance.
Right. So like no matter, as long as you succeed, you're going to do at least 1 damage, even if it's like, oh, well, this thing's really tough and has a bunch of armor. You're still doing 1 damage, which can really matter once you start talking about advantage, which is a huge part of the combat system.
Yeah. Advantage is great. So advantage is kind of like, how would you describe it? I guess I'd describe it as momentum.
Yeah, I kind of wish they'd use the term momentum more. So it represents how the tide of the fight swings in either direction. You can build up advantage by succeeding in combat and doing damage and whatnot. But if you take damage or fail on a test or suffer a condition, you lose all your advantage and just go back down to 0.
But every time you succeed, you get a point of advantage, and that keeps rolling up. And 1 point of advantage translates to 1 success level on your rolls. So if you're there carving through enemies, you hit 1, get a point of advantage, hit the next one, get another point of advantage. So it's kind of like you're building this great momentum in battle, and by the end of it, you could be, like never missing, essentially, just carving through enemies.
Yeah, it can get pretty crazy, which they have like a little box out in the rules that's like, so you probably want to cap advantage to something. So like we just have a blank, we house rule to just blanket cap it at +5, which is still +50 to your test. It can be a crazy amount, but there's always that chance to roll that 96 to 100 or still potentially roll worse than your opponent and lose a test even if you got +50. So advantage is one of those that there's a little bit of contention out there in the community, but I don't have a problem with it as long as you cap it. When we first started playing, we just went straight by the book. It said it capped it at 10, which is like, we found out quickly that's way too much. Having +100 is just, all right, I have a 5% chance to fail, and that's it. Like, just roll the 96 to 100. Otherwise, I pass with a bunch of success levels. So pretty quickly, we toned that down to 5, which seems to work pretty well. You get real good, but not completely unstoppable.
Yeah. That sounds a little bit more balanced. I also like the fact that the number you roll, when you roll to hit, the number that you roll also determines the hit location. For instance, like a 1 to 9, you hit the head, like 10 to 24, I think you hit the left arm and so on, which is cool because it has, there's a couple of aspects to it, but I like that it has a nice kind of finality to it as well. Like whenever I run a D&D game, I get my players to narrate, how they land their killing blow or whatever. But the way that this sets out the hit location for you, it tells you how you land that blow. So you might cleave the orc's arm off, or the arrow might go directly into the head or the eye of the oncoming beastman, which is cool.
I like that it sets up more story with it. Like you were saying, like, all right, you hit him in the arm, so the GM or the player can kind of get a bit better describe how they did it, instead of just like, okay, so you did 3 damage, good job. On to the next person. Like, so you slash them across the arm and you see their bicep is bleeding and their arm goes a little limp. And then you get into critical hits, which can just go crazy.
Yeah. So criticals work a little differently as well. Like, it's not if you roll 1 to 5 or 96 or above, it's like a crit or a fail. Like, that just means you fail. But a crit is when you roll a double, right? Like you roll a 66 or a 33 or something like that. That's when you roll a critical, and then there are these amazing tables for the critical fumbles table or the critical injury table when you do roll the critical. I like that the critical fumbles table is called the oops table as well.
I do wish they expand that. There's only like 6 or 7 results there. I want more on the oops table, but that thing's so much fun. It was like, whoops, your weapon dropped, or oops, you hit yourself, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Or on the very like high end of the scale, you hit an ally instead. Yeah.
But yeah, the critical hits are one of the best things about the combat system, where it can be anything from literally a stubbed toe to, well, you lopped their arm, you lost your arm, or the lingering ones, like you got a torn muscle, so you're going to have negatives to anytime you use that body part for like a month. But it's so good. It's just
you can have like flensed muscles, and if you take another injury, it starts bleeding again. And,
or like you bit your
really
tongue,
cool.
so you can't cast spells for a while.
Oh no. Yeah. It's great. I really like that your characters, like, every time a player enters into a battle, they can come out scarred or changed. So your character kind of changes and develops with time. Like you can lose a finger or you can lose an eye, or although if you roll like a 100, I think on any of the crit tables, like you just die. You lose a limb or you're decapitated. So that's not quite as fun, but
your critical wound is death.
Yeah. But it is cool that your like characters actually come out scarred and changed through time.
Another thing I like about this system, what Cubicle 7 is doing with it, is that it's kind of a living system where they're constantly updating it and addressing things that have been like potential issues with the rules, with new supplements and things, where if you got those books, awesome, you can use it. And if you don't, just play out of the core books. Totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Where I think it was Up in Arms is the book that added like replacement crit tables that are more expanded, larger, more possible results. And that I think is just good. A little harder to kill people because the numbers go up way above 100. But like if you take a hit and go below 0, that's when it gets real dangerous. It's not, you're not doing death saves. It's, do you have too many critical hits, or does your critical hit kill you?
Yeah, I do like the way damage, or they call hit points wounds in this system. But yeah, I do like the way that wounds and healing and everything works. I think, Warhammer sort of had this reputation as being like super brutal and super deadly, but I don't really think it's, especially compared to like old D&D. Like I played D&D first and second edition, and that was, if you get down to 0, you're dead. Like the amount of characters, how quickly you lose characters in AD&D and stuff is crazy. But yeah, the way it works in Warhammer is if you get down to 0 wounds, your character falls prone, and then you do take a critical injury. But then you go back to like 0 wounds. So you're prone, you're injured, but you don't die, and you're not dying. You're not making death saves or anything like that.
So the lethality of it, I feel like has gotten toned down a little bit in 4th edition, where 2nd edition we'd go through characters constantly, but they've added more, like people typically just call them meta points. Fate, fortune, resilience, resolve are ways, points that characters can spend to help keep them alive, which can keep them alive a pretty long time. Fate points are literally like extra lives.
That's like I choose not to die today, basically.
Right. Not today, which is something that's been around, I'm pretty sure, since the 1st edition of the game. I think that is pretty consistent. But you got things that give you rerolls here and there. You can like ignore conditions with other ones, even if you're when you're knocked prone. If you're at 0, if you can stay at 0 wounds for a while and be conscious, but you can spend a point of resolve to just like basically kip up, get to your feet, and get 1 wound back and stay in the fight. So there's a few things that can keep you alive for a while, because you can go down to any hit at any time. Really, even combat focused characters, there's been times where it's like, all right, you take 16 damage, and they're like, what? Which is a huge amount when average character has like 10 and 12 wounds.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you'll fall prone and you'll take a critical injury, but then you can spend that resolve, get back up, and have a few more rounds of like. So you might still land a killing blow on the bad guy and collapse a little later, maybe. Yeah.
Right, because luckily the typical NPCs don't get all that. They go to 0, they're done.
Yeah. Exactly. No, it's great. I really do enjoy the combat system. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's fantastic. Yeah, and I do like the conditions as well. You might be bleeding, or you can get stunned or deafened. All that kind of stuff is great.
Yeah, and they're all real bad.
Oh yeah. No, it's a really great combat system. There is also magic in Warhammer, right? It's not completely without magic. It's not like a complete low fantasy setting.
Right. Just relatively rare.
Yeah, but you can roll up a caster if you roll lucky enough.
Yeah, you could roll a wizard or a witch or a hedge witch. I think that's about it. Not many chances, but you could do it.
What do you think of the magic system and how magic works in Warhammer Fantasy?
I like it. They keep changing it every edition. I was real used to 2nd edition, where it was like your wizard level, how many points you had in your magic skill was how many d10s you rolled, and you'd add them up to see if you got the casting number. Now they I don't know if they would say simplified it. They kept it in line with all the other skills where you're trying to roll your language magic skill just like you would roll your weapon skill to attack somebody, but you can have talents and things that improve that and give you more successes and whatnot. So and you can also channel magic. You can essentially take extra turns to build up magical power and then cast it into a higher level spell, which I know some people complain that it's like, well, my wizard stands there for 3 turns and then does something. It's like, yeah, there are plenty of other spells you can do right away. The petty magic, you just need to successfully pass the test. And it's one of those, again, casters start out, they seem a little low level compared to like a melee fighter, but if you play a longer campaign, they get real good real quick.
Right, yeah. And I guess because it's a like I said, a simple test, like you roll under the number, you can also fumble. So there's a great miscast table in the book as well.
Oh, I love it when they miscast. One of my favorite moments of the campaign was just miscasting an open lock. He was trying to open a lock on like a desk, trying to find some evidence of something, and he miscast. And what I rolled ended up being like the spell casts successfully just somewhere kind of randomly within like a mile. And I was like, all right, I'm not going to tell you what happened right now. I was like, because I don't have an idea yet. But I was like, we'll find out in the future. So like, as I was actually listening back to it, something popped in my head and I was like, that's what it's going to do. And it had a big impact on the story and their relationships with NPCs they had met that like caused the death of an NPC. And it was just one of those, it was like my crowning moment as a GM that I thought of that. And it was just, it was just, it still gets brought up now during the game where it's like, oh, remember that guy? But they don't like the witch is the only one that realizes what happened there, because somebody was like, yeah, this door just randomly unlocked, and he was like, oh no. Miscasts are one of my favorite things because of what they can set up. Sometimes they're just silly, like all the milk within 100 yards spoils or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. One of them is like, oh, gross. It's like regurgitation. I think you just start vomiting for like 1d10 rounds or something.
Oh, sometimes or it's like you vomit, like blood pours out of all your orifices, and you vomit blood for like a little bit. It's gross and weird.
Yeah,
I had one back in 2nd edition, similar thing. If you miscast and all this crazy stuff happened, and there's a minor miscast table and a major miscast table, and the guy, he was just trying to summon like marsh lights to light the way upstairs, and he rolled on the minor miscast, rolled the result that's okay, now roll on the major miscast instead. He did, and accidentally summoned some demons. That it was like, all right, well, now there's demons fighting you. Sorry. And they're like, ah!
Oh, no.
It was so good.
I mean, magic looks pretty cool. I think everything else is kind of familiar with it. Like the book has a pretty extensive, quite extensive spell list to choose from. And there are like a bunch of different magic, they call them magic laws, right? There's like 8 different laws representing its own type of magic. There's light, metal, life, heavens, shadows, death, fire, and then beasts. So I think that's cool. Yeah, you don't have classes, you just have like a school of magic that you can dip into, right?
And then there's all like on the other side of that, there's chaos magic and necromancy. What's it? Oh, like demon summoning is its own thing. And then they've added more and more spells over time since the game came out. The supplement Winds of Magic has new spells for all the different lores. They even expand. And then there's witchcraft and hedgecraft of their own lores as well, which is really cool. So there's got to be over 100 spells at this point. There's so much you can do with magic.
Yeah, wow. And then there's also, if you're something like a priest, there's prayers and blessings and stuff as well, which really, maybe not as powerful as magic, but you can give people like blessings, like little bonuses and stuff like that.
Some of the miracles are nuts. There's, I think it was the Sea of Claws book that came out recently, the PDF version at least, where there's like an evil sea god called Stromfels, and one of their miracles is like you make a little, what's the word? Like a maelstrom around somebody's head, and it can just drown them. And it's like, whoa,
wow.
jeez.
Oh my god.
Yeah, there's some brutal stuff out there, especially for I like how they're expanding on these more traditionally quote evil gods like Stromfels and whatnot, and they're bringing back some things from the lore. Like there's a god called Solcan. Is that right? I might be saying that wrong.
Solcan?
I think it's Solcan.
Yeah.
Who is like a god of law, but to the point where like if you don't follow the law, you must be summarily punished, basically. So it's like sort of an evil god, even though it's all about following the law proper. It's like it's like almost the evil version of Verena. It's really interesting. I like it a lot.
Yeah, awesome. That's so good. Well, I mean, that's pretty much the system, right? Like I don't think there's anything that I've really missed. We don't really need to get into character progression or anything like that. But it is good the way it works. Like you don't really level up, right? You just get better at certain skills. You get better spells. Like it's not like D&D where it's when you get to 5th level, you have, 60 hit points and all that sort of stuff. It's more like you just progress in different ways and progress on your career path and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the nice incremental improvements where you get a little better at your things over time instead of like, oh, we got hit level 10, so now we're better at everything all of a sudden.
Yeah. No, I do like that. It's a slower progression. It means that even at high levels, like a couple of beastmen can still be deadly.
Yep. They get that crit in and you lose a foot.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no. So let's talk about what you need to actually play then. Like the book itself for 4th edition. I'm in Australia, so it costs around like $80 or $90, which I think is around $60 US, I'm guessing.
I think it's 60. It's a pretty hefty tome, but it's a big old book that has everything you need. I always suggest the starter set as well, or start with that, and then you don't have to have the rule book for that, which is kind of nice. I'm pretty sure you can play through the starter adventure without the rule book. It has enough in there to get you started, and then once you get through that adventure, get the core book, grab either something like The Enemy Within or Rough Nights, Hard Days is a really classic one that can string together a few adventures. But yeah, that starter set is so good. The production value on it is fantastic. There's a whole guide to the city that it takes place in. There's a good length adventure, not even like it's not really what most games come out with for a starter set that's like a couple little interactions and then a boss fight and you're done. It's like a substantial adventure that can really rolls into other things that Cubicle 7 has put out really well.
Oh, nice. I'll have to check it out. No. Yeah, but the book itself is great. Like you said, it's very hefty. It's got a really good layout. I love the artwork. I've got the book in front of me now. And it's good because it's like, when compared to some other systems, it's like everything you need to play. It's the player's guide, it's the jam manual, it's the bestiary, like all in one book. And the chapters are good. Like I had to flick through the chapter on game mastering. It's all pretty straightforward. And the bestiary is quite dense as well.
Yeah, the bestiary in this is great. It's a great start. They've added little bits here and there throughout the other books. Another thing that's really good in the book is I forget what the chapter is called, like Welcome to the Reichland or something. The lore chapter really sets the stage really well for the world. If you're new to the Warhammer world, it's a great introduction and gets you started and really makes you want to know more about the world.
Yes, and it's great. You don't need to know anything about the Warhammer universe to be able to jump right in, which is great. Yeah, and is there a lot out there in terms of GM resources, not just adventures, but things that can help a new GM jump into the system? Do you know?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of like digital things out there. There's no like SRD for it like other games have. There's the other products that Cubicle 7 has put out for the book. There's a bunch of little expansions and whatnot, a bunch of little adventures and things. Their presence on like Drive-Thru RPG is great. They have a lot of different product there for helping out new GMs. Other than the starter set, their city guidebooks are fantastic. So like, there's Altdorf, Crown of the Empire, and Mindenheim, City of the White Wolf, and the newest one, Salzenmund, the City of Salt and Iron or something like that, are fantastic setting books that really sets the stage for these cities with tons of adventure hooks, like little one-shot ideas, or you can easily take ideas from the book and make a whole campaign set in the city. I'm writing one now that we'll probably be doing a show of eventually, where the whole party plays as wizards at the Colleges of Magic in Altdorf, and just like basically trying to survive in this world as this like kind of this weird high-level class that's prosecuted in a way. It's really interesting to me. So like those source books are so good for mining for ideas for your campaign and just, again, setting the stage for the world. So I highly recommend their city books.
Yeah, nice. And also, if you go to the Cubicle or Drive Through RPG or the Cubicle 7 Games website, there's a couple of free adventures as well, which is great if you want to get started. I think there's some older ones that were from the original, maybe first edition, like If Looks Could Kill, and the other one that's free is called Night of Blood, which is the adventure that I have run for our actual play, which was a lot of fun.
Everybody suggests that as your first, like if you're really dipping your toe in, Night of Blood is the best place to start. It gives you that Warhammer feel right out the gate. Really well done. It's one, I think it was around from first edition, and they just kind of updated it to fourth. Classic one shot there. They got a ton of free ones, and they have a lot of these really great like $5 adventures that $5 I should say on like drive through that are PDF only and are just really high quality, well written. My favorite, we did Hell Rides to Halt a year or two ago. We ran, which is it's not a one shot. Most groups could get through it in just a couple of sessions, depending on how long your sessions are. We did it in just a straight shot of like 7 hours, which was exhausting, but so much fun. Ooh. I love those adventures that they put out. Those are really, really cool. That, a great one that you can throw into in the middle of a campaign as like a little distraction. There's the Adventures in Ubersreich books. I think there's 2 of them that each have a collection of adventures you could run together as a campaign, or other shorter adventures to fit in different places. There's a lot of resources for this game already, and it's only like 4 years old.
Yeah. All right. So I guess, final thoughts. I really, really enjoyed playing this system. I think it's one that everyone owes it to themselves to have in their collection. And I would definitely love to, I could see myself when I have the time actually running a campaign with this. I think it's very unique in terms of the rules and the setting. It definitely stands out for me against other fantasy systems.
Yeah, there's so much you can do with this one where it's not just go into a dungeon and do combat after combat after combat. You could do that. That's when your characters are going to start dying for sure, which makes sense. But there's so much of this game really kind of pushes that role play aspect and that adventure, that exploring and finding things out is just sky's the limit.
Yeah, and I do love that even through a small adventure, your characters are going to come out probably completely different people at the end of an adventure.
Right? They might even be mutated. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. You might be mutated. You might lose a limb. You might have new limbs. And just wait and see. All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much for chatting with me, talking to me about your experiences with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Hopefully, for everyone that's listened, it's been enough to convince them to pick it up and try it out. If you're not convinced, obviously, please listen to our actual play as we go through Night of Blood. Anything else you want to plug before you go?
Yeah, play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's the best game.
All right, and check out a grim podcast of Perilous Adventure and all the other fantastic podcasts on the Professional Casual Network.
Thanks. Yes, definitely. Or check out professionalcasual.com to see what else we have out there. We've got a lot.
And so they can find you guys on the website, Professional Casual Network, anywhere else?
Yep. So our socials, you can really just search for Professional Casual wherever. Facebook, we've got a bunch of stuff on YouTube. Regularly, we stream Marvel Crisis Protocol on Twitch every Monday, and then we have a couple other shows about that game throughout the week. We do some hobby streaming and things like that. What's nice about being the network is that we've got a few people involved that We can hit a couple nights of the week, and it's not the same person every time. So you can, pick your favorites.
Nice. All right. Well, Dan Cole, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see the rest of you on the next episode of RPG Quest. Bye-bye.
Bye.